Hello, my name is Joseph LeClaire. This video is for Criminal Justice 5326, Seminar on Police Practices at Texas A&M International University. I will be discussing the police use of deadly force and looking at some ways we can try to reduce the use of deadly force throughout the United States. I'm going to begin with an examination of a bit of the history and the legal basis for the police use of deadly force. Then I'll be going into how we can determine how police come to that point to use deadly force, followed by some policy suggestions, some that can be implemented now, some that may work out better in the future. So the legal basis for police shootings generally stem from two Supreme Court decisions. Prior to these decisions, there weren't a lot of legal basis nationally that regulated the use of deadly force. In the 1967 Commission on Police by President Johnson, it even discusses how there is a lack of consistency throughout the country. So in the 1980s, there was a case called Tennessee versus Garner. In that case, Edward Garner was a juvenile who was suspected of burglary of a residence. The police responded, and as they responded, Mr. Garner tried to jump over a fence as the police commanded him to stop. He did not stop. The police officer shot him in the back of the head, and Mr. Garner dies a couple of days later. Mr. Garner's family brought suit, saying it was an unreasonable seizure of their son. And at the time, under Tennessee law, it was permissible to shoot a fleeing felon, regardless of if they were armed or what type of felony it was. So the court looked at this, and they looked at it in the context of the Fourth Amendment, that deadly force is the ultimate seizure, the ultimate concept of a seizure. A police officer can arrest somebody, and yes, they are seizing them for the time being, but ultimately there's a trial. There's they can be found guilty, not guilty, but police use of deadly force is the ultimate seizure. So the court was not satisfied by them just being a felon without any other regard for danger. So that's where this concept of there must be a threat posed to the officer or an innocent third party. And in police practice, it turns into, does the suspect have the means, the opportunity, and intent to inflict deadly force or grievous bodily harm? So do they have the means in which to do it? A gun, a knife? Are they in a place where they can? If the person has a handgun and they are a mile away from you, that's not truly a threat. So that sets the standard of when police can use deadly force. Now, an individual state or jurisdiction, by state law or a policy of a police department, they can further regulate that. But at the federal standard is set by Tennessee and Garner. The next case that establishes police's use of deadly force, and really all types of force, is Graham versus Connor. Now, Mr. Graham was a diabetic. He was at his home. He started having a reaction to insulin. He has his friend drive him to a convenience store to buy orange juice. Mr. Graham walks into the store, sees that there are 4 or 5 people in line, and he realizes, hey, I can't wait this long. I need to get to another store. I need to get orange juice. He promptly exits the store and leaves. Well, Mr. Connor, as a police officer, observes this and believes that Mr. Graham has gone into the store and stolen something, shoplifting. So Graham is now, I believe, driving away. His friend's driving him away, and Officer Connor stops the vehicle, gets Graham out. There's a bit of a struggle. By the end of the scenario, after backup arrives and everything, Graham suffered a broken foot. And so we have a suspected shoplifting that actually didn't happen, and now a citizen with a broken foot. So the court looks at this, and what are we expecting our officers to see? So they come up with a standard called objective reasonableness. And to put it simply, you don't have to be right, you just have to be reasonable. What would a reasonable officer do in a situation like that? So an example that comes up a lot is individuals out there with a BB gun, an airsoft gun, a toy gun painted black with the orange tip removed. The police show up to a report of an armed person. The person does not drop the BB gun in time, and they're ultimately shot. they secure the scene. Now we have a BB gun. Well, that's not a deadly threat to the officer, but a reasonable officer approaching that scene of a report of a person with a gun, and someone with a gun, and say they pointed at him or something, that would be reasonable. Because how are you supposed to know that it's not a real gun? How long are you supposed to wait to find out that it's a real gun? So that's our legal basis for deadly force in the United States. There are some states that are making efforts to change laws, and some departments add more guidance to their officers for when they can engage in deadly force. Now, I want to talk about how we get to that point and how we can try to figure out where police make these decisions. So there's a very, very good article by William Terrell. It's called To Shoot or Not to Shoot. And he takes a look at a previous study in which researchers brought in police officers from the Spokane, Washington Police Department and conducted simulator training. Law enforcement simulator training is great. It, especially in basic academy and in refresher courses, it kind of puts the trainee or the officer in a spot to where they have to articulate and explain what they did, how they came to that conclusion to shoot, not to shoot, and these things can be mixed up. And so the researchers in the initial study find that the officers take 0.2 of a second longer to engage, to shoot a black suspect who is armed, longer than it would take them to shoot a white suspect. And so the researchers are very happy with this result. They think this is promising. Post-Ferguson, we have more conscious officers. Maybe we're finally bridging that gap that we have where black suspects are sometimes shot more quickly than a white suspect. But Terrell looks at this and he's kind of critical of the study itself, and I tend to agree. So the officers were selected from a department that had a couple of deadly force incidents in the previous few years. So it's not a department where they're not to say it's a problem for deadly force, but let's call it a problem where it's just rampant, it's happening all the time. And another thing he criticizes is that the study was conducted at a university by academics, and though the people conducting the study said race wasn't an overt factor, their officers weren't made aware of it, that's what they were looking into, Terrell's like, post-Ferguson, how is that not on an officer's mind? Hey, I'm going into a scenario with a simulator at the university. They're probably going to be looking at this. It's emanating from that. It's there. It's always there. Race is always there. It's something you can't say you're colorblind. It's something you're conscious of. So I think where we can go with this simulator examination, there's a lot of opportunities here. It's not perfect. An officer in training may not take the simulator seriously. And Terrell also points out that not having that real-world threat of death or serious bodily harm coming from that screen where, yeah, it's a screen and I'm doing my best to make a good faith effort to act how I would in the field, you are afforded a little bit extra time, just personally, to make that decision. But where I think we can expand on this training is not limiting it to one department. There are police simulators all over the country. We already have this great resource. If we can program it to where it's consistent, conducted as part of regular police in-service training. Let's not do this, you're going to go down to TAMU this week as part of your training, and they're going to take a look at you in the simulator. It's going to influence the survey way too much. So if it's part of regular police in-service, and maybe even the operator of the simulator is someone that they're familiar with, or they at least know is involved with police training, or is a vendor from the company that is operating. They don't actually have to be. It could just be under the guise of regular in-service training. But if the operators of the simulator are following a set script, what scenarios they're going to present, And then we record the debriefing after, asking the officer how they came to that conclusion. I think will be good to be able to really step into how police come to these decisions. And also, we're looking at all over the country, because a rural police department is going to be different than an urban police department. So, for policy discussion, I'm gonna go down a road I generally don't like to. I don't like to discuss the agency that I work for, just because of personal biases. I'm proud of my agency, and I also am privy to a lot of information that's generally not public and I can't disclose. But the statistics here and the facts are all public. They were in the news, or they're readily available on the CBP website. So we're going to go for it. We're going to look at the CBP. And when I talk about CBP, I'm talking about the Customs and Border Protection officers. They're the officers in blue at airports, seaports, land border crossings. They facilitate legal travel and trade. They inspect for agriculture. They do a huge job, but they don't have a lot of deadly force situations. It does happen, but it's extremely rare. Another law enforcement component of CBP is the Office of Air and Marine, and they're helicopter pilots, drone pilots, and boat operators out in the Gulf of Mexico, Great Lakes, Washington, San Diego, and they do a great job, but they don't run into deadly force like the U.S. Border Patrol does. So if we look at the use of deadly force just in fiscal year 2012, there were 55 deadly force incidents throughout all of CBP, but most of these are going to be Border Patrol though. And we go to 2018, and the number is down to 15. But over that time period, assaults on federal agents, federal officers for CBP in fiscal year 2012 was 555, and by fiscal year 2018 it was 794. So we have a drop of 55 deadly force incidents to 15, while assaults go up. So what happened? How did this change? How do we have assaults go up but deadly force goes down? So there's a little bit of history there. I started with the Border Patrol in 2008, and annually we would spend 8 hours a year on what would be considered intermediate use of force. We would recertify with pepper spray and with batons. And then every quarter we would have 8 hours of firearms training. Fast forward to 2011, we receive a new use of force policy that requires quarterly use of force training, intermediate use of force training, and continuing with the quarterly firearms qualifications. And at first, the use of force training was very loosely done. One station could be doing calisthenics and PT, another station is doing jiu-jitsu. It's now a curriculum has been developed, expectations of what the instructors are going to do have largely been streamlined. And so that's in 2011 we start doing that training. In 2014, after a examination by it's an outside group, they found that Border Patrol agents were putting themselves in situations in which they pretty much forced themselves to use deadly force. This included not moving out of the way of a moving vehicle, because if a moving vehicle is coming at you, that's a weapon you can defend yourself. But the committee found that there was times where Border Patrol agents were putting themselves in harm's way in that regard. And the other big one we have with Border Patrol that a lot of urban police departments don't deal with unless it's a riot situation is projectiles like rocks. So the committee found that agents were just kind of standing there and letting rocks fly and then opening fire. So in 2014, and this is all public, the use of force policy is online, available at cbp.gov. The policy was revamped to say that agents should, when possible, try to remove themselves from a dangerous scenario like that. Not step in front of a vehicle. If you can move to cover when rocks are flying, try to move to cover. So I'm going to argue that the implementation of quarterly intermediate use of force training, the use of force policy change, and then also the implementation of the electronic control weapon, the taser, reduced our number of deadly force scenarios. Now, the one caveat to that, there was a big shift between 2006 and 2009. The Border Patrol nearly doubled the number. So you could argue that maybe the workforce was maturing, and that's why we have less deadly force incidents. But I think the tangible evidence is there that we increased training, changed policy by a little bit, and we have a significant drop in deadly force scenarios. There's another type of training out right now that is catching on with some departments. That's implicit bias training. Now, implicit bias training goes out to the officers and discusses the biases that we have inside we may not know. You may think that you are fair and consistent, you treat everybody with respect and dignity, you're aware of things, but sometimes there are gaps in a scenario, and it's just human nature that we fill it with a stereotype. So the goal of implicit training is to try to make officers aware of that and to combat that. I think this is a good idea, but it's not consistent. There are different types of classes occurring in the field, and I think it should be conducted at training academies. I think before an officer has spent a lot of time in that enforcement role and has been hardened, like we would say about somebody in prison, we need to have people thinking about that from the very beginning when they interact with citizens. So presenting that to a 20-year veteran of a police force, it may not have the intention that we're having. There's an article in the Atlantic in which they do look at, is this training working? And one of the issues is that there's no way to quantify it. And they interviewed some officers with the Salt Lake City Police Department. And the officers were like, look, I'm not racist. And the only thing this training did was make me aware that I do have an implicit bias. I think that senior citizens don't commit crimes, and I'm not gonna let my guard down when there's a little old lady. So I don't know if that training's having the desired effect yet. I think something like this, incorporated into basic academies, is a wonderful thing, and it's going to be a generational shift. We had the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s that didn't end racism, it didn't end discrimination. It codified against it in employment and in places of business. But these feelings, these biases, it's something that we can't always teach out of people. So if we can raise people and develop people without these biases, that is where I think we're going to really be able to develop officers into better members of the community and more of a service to communities that have felt they haven't really been provided a service and are feel like more people like living under an occupation. There is a training that I think should be implemented nationwide, every type of law enforcement. That is de-escalation training. I think this can have practical results in the immediacy. So de-escalation is a mental health crisis intervention. So being able to recognize when someone is having a mental health crisis and how to approach that situation where it doesn't exacerbate the problem and ultimately lead into deadly force. Some of the suggestions are just being able to listen to what that person is saying and paraphrasing it back to them. It's very simple. If there's a person in a mental health crisis in the middle of the street with a knife and he's saying that the Martians are telling him that he needs to take over City Hall, say back to him, sir, I understand that there's someone telling you to do something that may hurt someone. Now, while you're talking to them and you're composing yourself in a calm voice with the police presence, your officer presence, you're in your uniform, you may be able to calm the situation down. At the very least, you can buy time, get bystanders out of the way, try to get more officers in, try to get more backup, try to safely close the distance, put that person at ease to where we don't need to use firearms. We have enough intermediate devices to use now. Now, the taser's not perfect. There's a high failure rate. If you're too far away, the prongs may not make that right connection. But if we can buy time, that doesn't mean we need to immediately go to a service weapon where we are deploying deadly force. So to wrap things up, we discussed the legal basis for use of force, how officers can come to that point to use deadly force, how we can look at that, and how we can better look at that. Looked at policy suggestions, increasing training, increasing resources in the field for intermediate devices, tasers, batons. There's other devices out there that can help mitigate these things that don't result in deadly force. Looking at implicit bias training and de-escalation training. And any of these things that we do that can try to reduce the number of deadly force incidents. It's never going to end. There will always be a time when a police officer has to use their weapon in line of duty. It's very rare for an officer, but the United States has a lot of firearms, legal firearms everywhere, illegal firearms. So that chance of deadly force will not subside, but if we can reduce it and prevent tragedy in a community, we're going to rebuild the trust in a lot of communities that haven't felt great about police, not even lately, but ever in some cases, where, okay, 50 years ago we have the police using fire hoses on people, and now we're using just brute force. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, comment something, let me know. I love talking about law enforcement and how we can develop better policy, better practices, and better training, because I want to leave my agency and the law enforcement world better than how I found it. Thank you.